So Matt, I am currently bleeding profusely. Well, not. I'm leaking plasma.
Is it that time of the month? Is it, Tom?
It is. It is. I got my almost entire side of my leg from knee to the ankle eviscerated by Lorenzo Evangelista in Leather Lane on Tuesday.
Looks so good. The classic Tom Riley versus Sutherland McDonald, who tattooed it better, frog snake competition.
Yeah, such a fantastic contextual bit of history that I have on my body now. And let me tell you, it has by far beaten out getting both my shins tattooed as the most painful tattoo I've ever gotten.
You were struggling.
Because it was like just below the knee, all the way down to my foot.
Yeah, and you had a long session, right? Like 5 and a bit hours.
Yeah, it was fucking miserable.
Too long.
If that experience sounds enticing to you before we get into the meat of this episode of Beneath the Skin, the show about the history of everything told through the history of tattooing, hosted by me, Thomas Manny, and I'm here with my esteemed co-host, Dr. Matt Lauder.
Hello.
If you want some cool history that you can bring home with you, we will be at the London Tattoo Show, the big London Tattoo Show on the 7th and 8th of September.
Shout out Perry and Emma.
Shout out Perry and Emma. Also shout out Perry and Emma for so graciously gifting us 5 pairs of tickets to give away on our Instagram. So go over and check it out there. But if you want some history to bring home with you, the wonderful Al Pomeroy and Aaron James are going to be tattooing some Greg Irons flash.
Yeah, so we got the okay from Ian, who's Greg Irons' nephew. I think certainly the kind of I don't know exactly what the familial relationship is off the top of my head, but he's the family member in charge of the archive, and he graciously gave us permission to allow us and the tattooers that we worked with to do a kind of like Greg Irons retrospective. It's 40 years in November that he was sadly and tragically hit by a bus in Bangkok. So we thought we'd do a little kind of Greg Irons memorial. We did the Jesse Knight thing last convention we were at. So this is going to be the Greg Irons retrospective weekend. Amazing redraws of Greg sheets. Greg did 33 flash sheets in his life, and then loads of other pieces. And Aaron and Al have like picked their favorite bits from his oeuvre, I suppose. Also maybe some bits from his wider artistic career, from his coloring books and his posters and all the other things that he did. And Al did Greg did a few conventions back in the day. He was at Queen Mary, for example, but he did an amazing shirt for the Tattoo 81 show in California. And basically Al's done an incredible line for line redraw of it. So you can buy at the show, and if we've got any left afterwards, incredible Greg Irons redraw on a shirt. So yeah, come along, and we'd like to see everybody. We'll be there.
Yeah, and if you want to enter that competition to win the tickets or see the shirt or stay updated on all the cool stuff going on with the show, like the thing that Paul found the other day, the 78 Sacramento judging clip that Paul found online. Follow us on Instagram, Beneath Skin Pod. But it's not just me and Matt talking shit to each other for an hour today. We are joined by an incredible guest. Matt, do you want to introduce our guest?
Yeah, another in the long line of incredible PhD endowed people that we've been privileged to have on the show. Welcome to Beneath the Skin, Dr. Jamie Jelinski. How you doing, man?
Good. All this talk of the London convention, we actually just wrapped up the Montreal convention over the weekend. So shout out to Val and Pierre for organizing the Montreal convention and for having me. Sold a couple books, did a couple lectures, and met a lot of great folks.
If I had to guess the names of the people that were organizing the Montreal convention, Val and Pierre would have been near the top of my list of guesses of first names.
Yeah, and I mean, they've been doing a great job. And interestingly enough, Pierre is from France, from Bordeaux, and came to Montreal in the 90s and worked under a fellow named Keith Stewart, who actually organized the first Montreal Tattoo Convention, which was in 93. And then there's a second edition in '94, and then there was a short lull, and then Pierre kind of took the reins. And I think this year was the 20th year, maybe 20. I'm not sure exactly, or maybe, I can't remember, but it's been going on for a while. But I first attended it, I think, 12 years ago, because I was living in Saskatchewan, and I flew in for the weekend to get tattooed. But this is my first time participating in it, and it was kind of interesting to see it from the point of view of participant rather than
other side of the desk.
Yeah, other side of the table. Yeah.
I want to get onto your book. We'll get onto your book in a second, Needlework, which just came out. But I guess maybe like the first question, just for listeners if they don't know you, like, what's your story, man? I mean, I've known you for a long time, but and I'm sure many listeners will know you from following you online and seeing the stuff you've done over the years. But like, what's your story? Just a kind of top line.
Yeah, we have known each other for quite a while now. From like right after I finished my undergrad.
I met you when you were doing your MA. Yeah.
Right before I started, and kind of interestingly enough, toward maybe like the last semester of my undergrad, I had already been getting tattooed for a few years, but maybe the last semester of my undergrad is when I found out about your work and Gemma Angel's work, and I read your dissertation, and by that point, Gemma had a few journal articles and book chapters out. So I had read your work, or both of your work, and I was thinking, oh, I didn't realize that this is actually something that people study in a really rigorous scholarly way. And I thought that might be something that I would do for my master's topic, which I originally wanted to do something related to graffiti, which I'm still interested in pursuing. But so then I just happened to be in London later that summer. I met you. You were super cool. You've been a mentor to me pretty much ever since, and the inspiration kind of paved the path that I'm
I mean, the feeling's
following
mutual.
now. Well, and then I did my undergraduate degree back in Saskatchewan, which for those of you who aren't familiar with Canadian geography, it's called like Western Canada, but it's more or less kind of Middle Canada. Then a master's degree where I studied kind of cross-cultural representations of Inuit tattooing and the types of images that came about as a result. But all along, I was really interested in, a larger project on the history of commercial tattooing in Canada. And, at that point, there was a little bit of stuff out on the United States, a little bit on what was happening in England, virtually nothing about Canada, a little bit of information online of questionable veracity.
Actually, that was a question I was going to ask. Is I think Canada, thinking about the North American continent, is not really thought about as much in terms of like tattoo history. And I just wanted to ask, I suppose, to establish the context for what we're going to talk about. What is kind of the current visibility and perception of tattoos in Canada?
I would say it's pretty much the same as where you guys are in England, pretty much the same as in the United States. Everything has become so globalized now with the internet. Canada has always had a huge, American culture has always kind of had a huge influence on happenings in Canada. So what's going on in the States tends, especially now with digital media, to have a big influence on what's happening here. But there's been this perception for a long time that the first tattooing in Canada was happening in like 1920s, and that the first electric tattoo machines in Canada came about in the 1920s, and that's just not true whatsoever. It just doesn't. When you think about it, it doesn't make sense. Like electric tattoo machines had been in existence for almost 40 years by that point, and they were just getting taken when people came over the border. That of course people are using electric tattoo machines here really early on, and there was pretty much a steady stream of people tattooing beginning in the 1890s through to the present.
I think it's funny in the sense that like for every aspect of kind of Canadian culture. There's this like information vortex where so much stuff is happening in Canada that no one knows outside of Canada. Is like, who is the tragically hip in tattooing of Canada?
Yeah, I mean, funnily enough, I did my PhD in this. I mean, the city where Tragically Hip is from, and close to my house, there was a street called Tragically Hip Way. But I think part of the reason why there's so little information on, I mean, Canadian tattooing, but Canadian cultural production in general relative to its American and international counterparts, specifically in the academic domain, the museological domain, is, I mean, there's this global perception that, you know, what's happening in Canada is pretty stagnant, and Canada is not really thought of as a sexy topic of conversation or even study. And I think that has a lot to do with it as well. But when you really dig deeper under the surface, the opposite is true. And I was talking to a friend of mine recently about this, who's an old carnival operator, circus object collector, just kind of expert in popular culture in Canada, who's also really interesting. And there's a National Film Board of Canada film called High Grass Circus, which features a traveling American tattooer. But the operator of this, the former operator of this circus, is named Al Stencil, and he's wrote a couple books on girl shows, on circuses, and just popular culture in Canada. And I was talking to him about this after I gave him a copy of my book, and he was saying, you know, people don't really realize what a rich cultural and social history there is in Canada. And so my book is, I mean, aiming to contribute to that.
And I think that's actually the perfect segue, I suppose, into talking about the book, because like at the start of the book, there is so much of that, you know, traveling amusements and circuses and everything. So I suppose, where does the story of tattooing in the modern age in Canada really start?
I mean, I would trace it back to, and I'm always reluctant to say it started at this point. My current research reveals, but I'm open to change should new information come forward. But the earliest person that I have found working as a commercial tattooer, a professional tattooer in Canada, was a Japanese man named Jay Murakami, who came to Canada in 1891 via San Francisco, and he had set up in San Francisco and worked there for not very long. And I wanted to try to understand why he might have come up to Canada. And San Francisco at the time, there was a lot of anti-Japanese racism happening, so that might account for it. Because the first newspaper coverage of him is only a couple months before he arrived in Canada, and he set up on Vancouver Island, just outside of Victoria, at what kind of is now more or less a suburb, but at the time, a place called Esquimalt, which the British Navy operated a naval base there. And so he probably would have been tattooing, the Royal Navy, members of the RN there, and then quickly moved to downtown Victoria.
And that's the story that parallels, you know, parallels Britain to some degree. Like
Right.
this move out of Japan, all these artists that have had to leave Japan through the 1880s and 90s and finding places to work in the diaspora.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then the one newspaper account, he actually mentions that he left Japan due to restrictions on his work.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. I mean, I think like one of the things that made the whole story of like why professional tattooing started anywhere was that story, right? So it's, again, just incredible to find that detail that you found of the Canadian story is true. Is there kind of like a pre-professional specific Canadian history that comes out of the very specific kind of economic geography of Canada? Like, is there tattooing amongst like fur trappers and, you know, the particular kinds of trades that's happening in like 19th century Canada before the pros arrive?
I mean, that's a great question, and kind of reading your forthcoming book in some ways made me really saddened that I didn't have that kind of pre-professional history to draw from. I haven't encountered any of it, but I suspect in like ports like Halifax, Victoria, this type of thing likely was happening. It just really wouldn't make sense to me that it was happening everywhere else,
yeah.
but here. But that's something that I really haven't found any sort of
I mean the data is so sparse and sprinkled, but I just think, as you said, I mean you make it really clear at the beginning of the book, like when we're defining what professional means, like we're really making some quite arbitrary decisions about what we're talking about, but it's actually about
exactly.
Can you as a stranger walk in and pay someone money who's advertising to the general public?
Exactly. So I try to take as general of a approach to defining who is or who is not a commercial tattooer. I try to be inclusive rather than exclusive. So, I mean, there's a number of tattooers who worked in Canada over the course of, I mean, from the late 19th century through to the late 20th, who worked for maybe a couple months or for a couple years. And I considered, and in really diverse locations, ranging from different sorts of temporary accommodations to personal residences to standalone storefronts. But I've kind of lumped them all in as long as they were doing tattooing to earn income for however brief of a period. I consider them to be commercial tattooers.
And one of the things I liked about the way you structured the book that was quite unusual, actually, in this touch upon something you were just saying, was like you do structure the book quite regionally or in terms of different cities. So for people that aren't familiar with Canadian geography, like why did you make the decision to structure the storytelling that like that? Is there very specific, self-contained, like regional, urban scenes happening in Canadian tattoo history? Are they much more isolated than place tattooing elsewhere?
That it has something to do with it, but at the same time, if I was going to move chronologically, I just felt that I couldn't really give the depth that was necessary, and that there would be a lot of replication over the years. And so I had this massive body of research, and I kind of just looked at what the primary research was telling me about these particular cities, and then wrote these chapters accordingly, rather than choosing to move in like the kind of rather predictable chronological route. But so I mean, to go back to the specifics of the question, for example, Halifax had a really deep history of tattooing intersecting with the visual arts in a way that other cities did not. In British Columbia, we see, or specifically Vancouver and Victoria, Victoria being the capital of British Columbia, and kind of the political and commercial and financial hub, and Vancouver kind of being more of the cosmopolitan center. It's in those cities that we see tattooers working in like such a greater diversity of spaces in comparison to elsewhere. So, I mean, and you can trace this, and it's almost like a straight path from hotels, lodging houses, rooming houses, then to working at arcades. And then we start to see the emergence of dedicated tattoo shops. And there's a couple briefly operative tattoo shops in Vancouver prior to that, but nothing of the same temporal extent that we see. And then toward the latter 20th century in Vancouver, you also see tattooing start to emerge in art spaces as well. So, I mean, there's like kind of the geographic areas, because you have this Vancouver Victoria chapter, you have this Halifax chapter, then I have this dedicated Toronto chapter that looks at tattooing in Toronto during the late 70s or early 80s through the eyes of a painter named Abba Bayevsky. But then I kind of jump around in other chapters. The first chapter on regulation moves across Canada, and then the second chapter really takes us all over North America as police pursue Sailor Joe.
And I was going to say, and we'll definitely talk about Sailor Joe in a second, but I want to say
I really love talking about him. To me, it's the most fascinating character in the book.
Yeah, Tom was really excited to talk to you about him.
But like one thing that I think is really fascinating, and it's similar in like other history books, not necessarily about tattooing, that are about countries that are similar to Canada in the sense that like massive countries that have these hyper local pockets of culture, and to tell a history of a country like that, you instead of moving like in a linear sense temporally, you have to take the journey through these like hyper local contexts of geography. And it's similar with like other things that I've read about Canada, in the sense that if you're talking about time, there's so many things that are happening all at once and are like moving in different directions, but in a way to tell a cohesive story, you instead have to look at these like hyper local contexts and like this thing is happening here and this thing is happening here at the same time, that seem to be going on like diverging paths or converging paths to kind of meet in the middle, but you can't tell that story time wise. You have to like look at it geographically. And that's why I want to talk about Sailor Joe, because it's such a perfect example of that, like that hyper local context of his dad was a candle maker, and you know, it's like these things that like seem kind of time out of joint, but when you look at them in the local context, make sense. So do you want to tell me about Sailor Joe? Because this is an incredible story.
So, I mean, funnily enough, Sailor Joe was from King's. His full name is Joseph George Simmons. And when he started tattooing in the 1920s, he adopted the pseudonym Sailor Joe. But he had, in fact, been Sailor Joe prior to that, because he was a sailor on Lake Ontario, one of the Great Lakes, and was from a fairly wealthy and prosperous, well-known
I'd say
local
top
family.
five.
Top five what?
On the lakes.
Oh, right. No.
Sorry.
Oh, you get
joke.
Yeah.
Matt, top 5 lakes right now: Lake Ontario, Lake Tanganyika, Loch Derg,
Titicaca.
Lake Titicaca. Jamie, what's the 5th best lake?
Sailor Joe. And so, I mean, he was a sailor and then signed up for service in World War I, but didn't see a deployment. And he had long-term health issues, namely vision and mobility issues. And
So funny. He was basically blind, right? Like blind tattooer.
Yeah, he was basically blind from a young age, and it was likely hereditary because his brother had vision issues as well, and so did their father. And he had mobility issues as well due to apparently infantile paralysis. So shortly after he signed up for World War I, he was discharged. He didn't even leave Kingston. And he had already had some tattoos on his body by that point. You see them mentioned in his World War One service file. And at some point, he took up tattooing from the premises of a local veterans organization, which actually just happened to be a couple blocks from where I lived in Kingston, because I did my PhD in Kingston. And then shortly thereafter, a huge carnival came to Kingston, one of the sort that the city had never seen previously. And this was, I mean, part of a bigger emergence in Canada and specifically Southern Ontario at the time, where these exhibitions were traveling from city to city. And this would have been really novel and probably super fascinating to him. And it's kind of the classic story of someone running away. I mean, not with the circus, but with the fair or the exhibition, and he did just that. When the exhibition left, he left with it, and he came back shortly thereafter to get permanent permission to stay in the United States, and he kind of made the United States home of a sort for roughly the next 20 years, where he traveled across the United States almost incessantly, living in this itinerant lifestyle, tattooing from rented storefronts, carnivals, exhibitions. Go ahead, Tom.
Oh, I just want to bring up as well the incredible letters that he was writing back to the local newspaper to tell everyone how great his life was.
Yeah, that's amazing. That's like really amazing. And those provide, I mean, really strong insight into his life. Because, yeah, so for listeners, he would write letters back to the local newspapers telling them how successful he was, all the things that he was seeing, including traffic lights, which Kingston didn't have at the time. Telling him about all the types of people he was working with, the cities that he was in. But those letters are also important, not just for the information that they reveal, but also for kind of his bombastic showmanship. And in some ways, a lot of the stuff he says you have to take with a grain of salt, because he was a prolific liar, exaggerator, and this started at a pretty young age.
I have to say, Jamie, I think every single tattoo artist at this time was an extremely prolific liar.
All of them.
I think he might be up there with the greats in that regard.
Matt, top 5 liars tattoo artists.
Sutherland MacDonald is like number 1 because he claimed to tattoo like several kings that he definitely didn't, right?
Sutherland MacDonald, Sailor Joe. Are we throwing in George Birch out there? Horatio. We were talking about this last the other night.
Horatio is definitely it worked for him though. That was an excellent lie. Like, that's a persistent fucking lie.
No, it really worked well.
We're listen, for anyone listening, we are going to do an entire episode about this at some soon. But it just reminds me of the Father Ted clip. Is like, and now on to the liars. But anyway, Jamie, continue. Sorry, we're constantly interrupting you. But this is just
please interrupt. No, please interrupt, because I mean his story is a long one. So after living and working in the United States for roughly 20 years, he found himself afoul of the law a couple times for relatively harmless actions. But then in the 1940s, he had violated a law called the White Slave Traffic Act. And the White Slave Traffic Act was federal legislation in the United States, which was intended to had a lot of racial undertones, or overtones rather, and it was intended to prevent specifically white women and girls from being forced into sexual slavery, particularly by Black and Asian men. But the law kind of turned the FBI, or helped turn the FBI into this nationwide law enforcement body, and really led to significant growth amongst the FBI. And so he had violated the White Slave Traffic Act, not for having sexual relations with this minor named Avely Witten, although he had tried. But the law, what he had actually violated the law by doing was taking her from one state to another. So when he crossed the state line, then he had already committed the crime, even though he hadn't engaged in any sort of assault or anything of the sort at that point. And so because he had violated this federal legislation, the FBI became involved and started tracking him throughout the United States. And his investigation file provides a lot of insight, not only into his lifestyle and movements, but also tattooing in general in the United States in the 1940s, because the FBI would get a tip in one place and then rapidly send it to a field office in another place, where they would talk to one tattooer and to the next, to the next, to the next, to the next. And eventually they managed to locate him in Baltimore, arrested him, and he made bail. And eventually...
for those listening at home, the White Slave Traffic Act was a very, very racist piece of legislation that was used for anti-miscegenation purposes. So white women couldn't flee or cross state lines to marry Black men. So very, very racist. The FBI is a very evil entity. All 3-letter agencies
it's
are
normally
evil.
referred to as the Mann Act, right?
Mm-hmm.
The Mann Act, yeah.
Yeah, I'm getting on my soapbox.
Crazy.
All 3-letter agencies are evil. Don't trust the police. Fuck police. This is an ACAB podcast. If you're a police officer listening to it, turn it off. Back to you, Jamie.
Yeah, and anyways, and so they made the mistake of granting him bail, and he fled again. He fled, eventually to be captured again, made bail once more, and then fled back to Canada. And then the FBI and the RCMP, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, had recently developed cross-border policing relationship. And so they used this relationship to track him across Canada. And they were spying on him as he moved from city to city.
How exactly do you spy on someone when you're sitting on top of a horse wearing a giant hat? Oh, wait, the guy's over there tattooing. Just like you look out your window of your studio and just see a horse's face looking in the window.
But behind a newspaper with two eyes cut out with the little ears.
That's all.
Out.
I mean, for the listeners who don't realize that you're joking, I mean, that's only for ceremonial purposes. The horses, and actually, I know a lot about that because I grew up in Regina, which is where the RCMP's training facilities are, and so I would see them in the full red outfit and the horses. But in any case,
that's a lot of energy and effort to put into chasing down one. He was he still with the woman who he was alleged to have abducted?
He was never with her. She fled the first night at the hotel room.
Wow. So I mean, this is like it's an insane amount of energy and money.
Multiple years.
Yeah,
multiple years trying to track him.
So where does this bring Sailor Joe's story to now?
Well, so I think he didn't feel immune to arrest. And what happened is shortly after he arrived back in Canada, he effectively stole what we would consider now as identity theft. He appropriated his brother Vivian's identity and began living and working under the name Vivian Augustus Simmons. And so actually the way this whole Sailor Joe story opened up is Carmen Nissen had been researching Sailor Joe in the United States, and I had been researching
because
Sailor
he was an associate
Joe,
of Bert Grimm, right?
Bert Grimm, yeah, among many others. But I had been researching Sailor Joe in the Canadian context. But he really only emerges on the map in Canada after he fled back, and so all the newspapers were calling him Vivian. And then Carmen had told me that there was a Sailor Joe in the United States named Joseph George. And then I came to find out what really happened is it was the same guy.
Unbelievable.
And they never caught him. He was never held accountable for the alleged actions, but he had lived in a relatively impoverished state in the back of his tattoo shop. But when he died with the equivalent of roughly 300,000 present day Canadian dollars in the bank. He was by no means a poor man.
I mean, it's incredibly. There was like letters to J. Edgar Hoover, like the head of the FBI.
Yeah, Hoover
track down this guy.
Hoover knew about Sailor Joe and was actively involved in the investigation. But I don't think that is exceptional. I think J. Edgar Hoover really was micromanaging almost every aspect of the FBI and was deeply involved in almost all of its investigations. But yeah, it's incredible to see these letters from Hoover discussing this Canadian tattooer.
Unbelievable. And before we just quickly move on, I mean, can we quickly talk about the blind aspect of him? Because I always found that hilarious. And you actually saw someone in 2017, right? Who had a tattoo done by Sailor Joe. So you've seen some of his work in the flesh. How did the fact he was blind figure into his tattoo career?
So when you look at the existent photographs of him, and as I had mentioned, so it was recorded in the 1910s that he had vision issues. But then when you look at photographs of him over the course of his life, he's wearing glasses, and you can tell that these are a really strong prescription. They're magnifying.
As a man who also wears big milk bottle top glasses, like solidarity, really.
But I think one of the more interesting parts about that aspect of his career is he adapted to it. And for example, whereas most people were drawing flash, Sailor Joe's flash essentially was collaged images taken from magazines, newspapers, and various other sources, and then they would be interspersed amongst largely drawn singular designs rendered in really bold black ink. And so my belief is that the way that he was drawing his Flash in this really large, bold manner was a way of adapting to his disability. And so the one tattoo that I had seen, it's essentially just like an anchor done super, super thick, dark. And it's not something that's aged in that way. It's something that was applied in that way.
So, Matt, are we arguing that Sailor Joe was the originator of black work then?
Well, I was about to say, like, it's almost like a Duncan X piece. That if you can see the photo, it goes so hard.
Also, I want to point. Also, I want to point out a couple of pages before in the book, before the picture of that tattoo, you have a public transit card and from the Power and Electric Company, certifying that Sailor Joe is legally blind.
Mm-hmm. So he didn't get the legally blind designation until later, much later in his life, almost like in his last years. And at this point, he became involved with the Canadian National Institute for the Blind, the CNIB, partially to deal with his disability, but also by being legally blind, he was entitled to money. Like a disability. And so he was lying to them about the amount of money he had in the bank. And then he really wanted these free transit passes. And part of the deal was by getting these transit passes and being supplied with this disability income is he had to walk with this white cane. Well, obviously, this tattooer who's tattooing on main streets in Toronto, Halifax, Montreal doesn't want to walk around with a white cane. And so there was some issues between him and the CNIB about his use of it.
Hey, are you enjoying the show? If you really like Beneath the Skin and you want to help support us, you can do so on Patreon. For little as £5 a month, you can help make this show possible. Help us buy research materials. So if you like the show and you want to support us, consider kicking us a few quid a month. And you'll get everything from bonus episodes to Q&As, and you can even vote on what tattoo I'll get when we reach a certain subscriber count. Matt, have you got anything to say?
You should really definitely fund the Patreon because tattoo history is massive, right? Deep, wide, complicated. We're covering some big hit topics on the main feed, but on the Patreon subscriber-only feed, we'll be getting into some really more interesting, niche, deep topics you don't want to miss out on. And honestly, the chance to kind of decide what Thomas gets on his body is probably just a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Subscribe, chuck us a few quid. Don't miss out on the chance to ruin Thomas's body forever.
Funny. So the other, I could just talk to you about some details in the book all day, but I wanted to, more for the benefit of the listeners, I suppose, talk to you about Doc Forbes, talking about kind of legendary, important figures in Canadian history. Because like Doc Forbes, you know, we've been talking a lot on the podcast recently about these kind of Tattoo Club of America networks, which are sort of quite generative, I think, of what happens next. And like Doc Forbes is, you know, one of probably 2 or 3 like key Canadian members of that circle. I was very pleased to see, and thank you for pointing this out to us, in your book, you've got the Doc Forbes shop front photo of him standing outside his shop with, in the background, the cheap poster of the Norman Rockwell tattooist thing that we saw in Rudy and Helder's house. That's the only thing we left behind with his ancestors.
Because we were literally in the room and we're like, Rudy's.
I mean, you should tell the full story about this to people who like people who follow me might not necessarily listen to the podcast and what you found behind it.
So we traveled the whole way to Rudy and Helder's house in rural Switzerland.
On the border of Liechtenstein.
On the border of Liechtenstein. This is before the souvenir guy in Liechtenstein showed me the Nazi stamps. The story for another time. We got into Rudy's house and his nephew were very kindly showing us around the house, offering us coffee and cake. And he was showing us in the bedroom. And leaned against the wall was a print of Norman Rockwell's The Tattooist, insanely sun faded, as well as a small piece of flash.
In a really cheap, shitty frame.
And Paul immediately was like, "That's Doc Forbes' flash. That's original," and just picked it up. And then when we were leaving, we asked about the painting, and Rudy's nephew says, "Oh, I want to keep it because it's funny." And we thought, how many of these prints are around? And then Matt sent a picture to you, and you said that was probably hanging in Doc Forbes' shop window.
Right. So essentially, the print that you found was the one that's the one in the storefront image in the book, and in the frame on the back was a piece of Doc's flash that is going to be reproduced in Matt's new book.
Yeah, with the design he did for the Tattoo Club of America, like logo with the sequence.
Matt, are we giving away the goods if we? Because I see your book behind you. So this flash that we're speaking of will be in the new book.
It is. It's in the new book.
Arguably the most valuable thing monetarily in that entire collection we left behind because we thought it was like, oh, this is just a cheap print that we've seen hundreds of times.
So funny. So I mean, so Forbes, Forbes comes up a lot, right? Because he was networked with the US, he was networked with the UK. He was good, close friends with the Scoozes. He was friends with Tattoo Sammy in Germany. Like, he was a really interesting, really sort of nodal figure for the global reach of Canadian tattooing. So yeah, tell us a bit about Doc Forbes. Like, where's he working and when, and how does he become this kind of networked figure?
Right. I mean, he was from rural Ontario, a place called Burkes Falls, and his early career was spent as a showman traveling across Canada doing different acts with circuses and carnivals, and then moved, like many of people who were working in that line of work, to the United States, and eventually picked up tattooing down there from what he referred to as a quote-unquote Hindu tattooer. I'm not sure who that may have been. I'm sure some people might have some ideas. But and eventually located back to Canada and settled in Victoria on Vancouver Island. And then the next couple decades bounced back and forth between shops in Vancouver and Victoria, working from, arcades, and then opening up his own dual purpose arcade tattoo shop. He stopped tattooing for a little bit to take up photography. But then roughly by like the 1960s, you kind of see this this concerted effort to fashion this doctor persona of tattooing. Like, prior to that, he was going by Doc Forbes, but apparently because he was touring early in his life, a set of preserved medical specimens. But later in life, when he becomes this doctor of tattooing, not working from these kind of rambunctious arcades, he decides to be this doctor of tattooing and develops this shop that is super clean, has a lot of medical equipment on hand that he probably wasn't even using. They were just props to signify cleanliness and hygiene. A lot of stainless steel. But yeah, I mean, he was in many ways so prolific because, and like Sailor Joe, he was a showman and he knew how to self-promote, but he was also prolific and well-known around the world because he was an incessant correspondent. And he was keeping in touch with, I have a couple letters here that he was writing to Nels Johnson in Thunder Bay, Ontario. And these were not just small notes, they were long letters that had not only updates about his work, but he was pretty generous with information sharing, unlike a lot of these
and
people.
They survive, don't they? Like, I've seen a few in different collections. They survive like whole scrapbooks of photographs. Like, he's not just sending people like one or two photos. He's sending sometimes whole like pasted up scrapbooks.
Yeah, so that's what I was going to mention as well. So alongside his letters, and he had this long-standing interest in photography and even worked as a commercial photographer for a time. And that's why there's so many images of Doc Forbes and his work in collections around the world and in books like 1000 Tattoos, because he was sending these images of himself, his clients, all over alongside these letters. And so he would take a couple of photos, reproduce them, and send them all over, write on the back of them, stamp them, put a sticker on the back. And so the tattoos became, promotional devices as well. Or sorry, the photographs became promotional.
Yeah, I mean, Paul King and I were talking about this recently. That like actually one of the real, again, common points between the people that we talk about a lot, is they're largely men who have ability to take photographs. Like William Granger, Ethel Granger's partner, who we talked about on a separate episode. Camera, Fakir Mushafar camera, like the abilities, particularly for things like
Rudy Inhelder.
Yeah, and a lot of Doc Forbes's photographs are a bit racy. There's like a lot of nudity, a lot of sexuality in some of his photos that are circulating still around collections.
Yeah, a bit racy is even putting it mildly. At some point, there's some there's some dubious content in some of them.
Yeah, but it's interesting. Yeah, this ability to kind of take and share photographs is a really interesting kind of common thread between a lot of the people that we talk about, right?
Yeah, no, exactly. And I mean, not only that, he was appearing, unlike his contemporaries, in the media all the time, in a way that others in Victoria and Vancouver were not anywhere near to the same extent.
So could you say he was bucking the trend of the whole myth of Canadian humility?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. But I think probably a lot of that came with not only living and working in the United States for so long, but like Sailor Joe, working on the amusement circuit.
Yeah, and he worked with Pat Martiniuk, right?
I mean, so I don't because I should say, like, the book is almost oversighted, because everything that I say in the book, I want to be based on empirical, provable evidence that I can point to when it comes to connections between people. So there is a narrative that Pat Martinook learned to tattoo from Doc Forbes. I don't know if that's true, but they two definitely had a relationship, because there's photographs of them together. What that relationship was, I'm not so sure. But I mean, Doc Forbes, as much as he was a tattooer and a correspondent, he was also manufacturing machines and selling machines, mixing ink, selling ink to people. So people came into contact with him through that as well. So did Pat Martinook learn to tattoo from Doc Forbes, or did he perhaps buy a couple machines from him and Doc showed him how to turn them on? That's a lot different than learning from someone. But what I can tell you is there was a fellow named Roy Johnson who learned and worked under Pat Martinook in Edmonton, who then later wanted to open up his own shop, but Pat wouldn't sell him in Edmonton. But Pat wouldn't sell him equipment, and so he went all the way to Vancouver to get equipment from Doc Forbes, who sold it to him. It doesn't seem as if he was. I mean, especially if Roy was working in Edmonton, too concerned about selling people supplies.
And again, like for listeners, like Pat Martiniuk's another one of these interesting figures who kind of crosses out of Canada and becomes a kind of interesting influence on Californian tattooing, right?
Yeah, I mean, Pat has the name Picture Machine, but I don't even use the term Picture Machine in the book, because he didn't acquire that name until he had left Canada. And so, yeah, Pat started tattooing in Edmonton, and then eventually migrated to San Francisco, where he worked with Lyle Tuttle, acquired the name Picture Machine. But I mean, Pat's early career in Edmonton is really not that exceptional. And he didn't, in fact, work in Edmonton for that extended of a period, but he continued to own the shop in Edmonton after he left, which was called Pat's Tattooing. And so what happened is he left Edmonton to go work in the States, and a guy named Rick Noddings was working at the shop. But then, let me get this straight. Pat's daughter started dating a fellow from Bay Area in California named Randy Wecklich. And when Randy was young, Pat taught him how to tattoo, and then both Randy and Pat's daughter went to Edmonton, and Randy took over the shop. And tattooed.
I think like I've got a piece of Picture Machine flash on my leg because his stuff is like janky in just the right way. Like I think it's one of those kind of kind of like 1970s revivals of American wartime traditional that I think ended up being really influential on a lot of the people around San Francisco at the time, like people like Higgs especially, because like I encourage listeners to kind of Google image search Picture Machine Flash, because his stuff is like, it's the kind of weird that you can't affect. Like you have to believe in your soul that like I've got a kind of a big Mustang, like a big horse, like fighting a snake, and they're both comically missized. It's so janky, but like I have a huge affection for Picture Machine's stuff, and he's again to talk about my new book, that there's the family tree of California tattooing that Ed Hardy and the Oakland Museum put together in 1977, and like Martin Yook is there with a big arrow like heading out to Canada, like in the yonders, like because he's this interesting kind of feed in at that point. I guess the last person I wanted to ask you about before we move on, I know Tom's got some other things he wants to talk to you about. The other guy that is interesting to me is Speedy Robinson, who I first really heard much about because there was a sheet or two of his flash in Jesse Knight's collection in England.
Right. One of which is in the book.
So yeah, I was super excited to see that, man. So like, what's up with Speed? I mean, again, another sort of slightly unsavory character in some senses, maybe in places.
So this might appeal to you two and your audiences. Speed was from Ramsgate, Kent.
Yeah.
And he ended up in Southern Ontario as well as a teenager.
In fact, quite a lot of the artists that you talk about came from England, right? Charlie Snow, who you came to talk
Charlie Snow, like Charlie Snow, who is one of the most long-term and famous tattooers in Canada, was from England, and I spent a bit of time under your supervision in 2017, looking into his early life there. Fred Baldwin, English as well, but and then I mean someone like Ben Corday worked in Canada as well. But when it comes to Speed Robinson, full name Albert George, he ended up in Canada as a teenager in Ontario, and then at some point had moved over to the West Coast in Vancouver. And so when Doc Forbes settled in Vancouver, his neighbor actually was Speed Robinson. And there's some conflicting accounts, but because Speed will say that he became interested in tattooing as a teenager, but he really only starts tattooing commercially once him and Doc Forbes are in really close proximity. Up until that point, he was working as a janitor. And so those two ended up moving to Victoria from Vancouver and opening up a tattoo shop / arcade there. And then they kind of split the business. There's nothing that suggests like ill will between them over the course of their career, like successive newspaper coverage. They mention each other positively. There's lots of photographs of them and their families together over successive years. So they split the business. They each had a tattoo shop in Victoria. Business, by all accounts, was going really well during that period. And then eventually Speed moves back to Vancouver and works at a couple different arcades on East Hastings Street up until his death. And then shortly after he dies, Doc Forbes relocates to Vancouver and starts working there once more.
And am I right that they got raided for obscenity for some of the images they were selling? Was that right?
Yeah, right. So when they were in Victoria, they were, I mean, the archival record and the newspaper record is a little bit vague when it comes to this, but they were passing out cards. That's what they're referred to, whether or not it's business cards or some other sort of promotional material with obscene content on it, which led to their shop being raided. And I got a hold of the exhibit list from the court record book, which mentions that like a couple hundred Doc Forbes business cards were seized. So, but also what was seized, rather interestingly enough, was a magazine called Body Beautiful. And if you two aren't familiar, or the listeners, Body Beautiful was on its face a men's bodybuilding magazine, but what it actually was used for is kind of like borderline, not quite pornography, but a way for homosexual men to consume images of other really ripped men.
And this is in the 50s and 60s, and a bit later. When was that?
I forget exactly. It's in the 50s or the 60s.
Yeah.
And so they were charged. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say, so it's that kind of of that time, like very coded kind. I mean, those kind of publications have existed since the 19th century, right? Where people that were queer or fetishists or whatever get to kind of be slightly visible under the cover of a kind of plausible deniability.
Exactly. And so that's also, I mean, to me, there's not enough evidence to make the claim that, that these two men may have been queer or what, but there's some, but the fact that they had that in their shop, and then there's some photographs that Doc Forbes had taken that are still extant today, that reveal he was moving in like a crowd of people consisting of gay and lesbian individual. And so how they were identifying, I don't know, but they were definitely amongst this crowd.
Yeah, I mean, this is really probably one of the main things that I've been with Paul been working on over the last couple of years. It's like like Rich Mingens is my best parallel that comes to mind, who's as far as we know, definitely not gay, married to a woman, but lots of photos of him in these trading networks that are, posed in a very homoerotic way. Let's put it that way. There's nothing
like Doc, like Doc as well.
Yeah, and we know that Rudy Inhelder was a correspondent of Doc's, and like Picture Machine, Pat Martinyuk was like involved with the second version of the TCA with Spiderweb, again, not gay, but this kind of queer adjacent. There was a lot of queerness around, and I think you're right. There's just because someone owned or was distributing a bodybuilding magazine, there's no reason to presume that those people were themselves gay or queer identified. But there's definitely a lot of queerness under the surface of that period of tattooing than I think people realize, right? Even amongst
it's the tattooing equivalent of reading Playboy for the articles.
Yeah,
there you go. Exactly.
It is a bit, right?
I'm not gay. I just love the tattoos. It's okay. Listen, we gotta let straight men have fun too. I'm allowing all of you straight men to enjoy and have your fun. Look at the muscle guys, have your fun. But like, speaking of that kind of like, I suppose weirdness maybe is the wrong word to use, but like the kind of art wars that are going on in Halifax, because Halifax really seems to be where tattooing is weird. And this is where my interest is definitely peaked.
Yeah, I mean, but Halifax had the art college. And so wherever you have art college, you have those sorts of activities going on. But I mean, the art college in Halifax had existed for, so it's called the Nova Scotia College of Art, and then it was renamed in around 1970 in the Nova Scotia College of Art and Design, and I mean now it's known as NSCAD University. But up until the late 60s, but really things started to turn around 1970. NSCAD was just kind of this relatively regional institution that didn't really exert much influence on art making beyond Halifax or the province of Nova Scotia. And the Board of Governors were like, we need to make a change. Let's bring this up to date with what broader currents in contemporary art beyond Halifax or even Canada. And so what they did is look south of the border and hired a new president named Gary Kennedy. And shortly thereafter that, NSCAD started to change significantly. And they set up a lithography studio there. They started bringing visiting artists up from the States and all over the world. And I mean, except one of them being, of course, I think Matt calls him creepy old Vito Akanji. Matt, we were just talking about, are you still calling Vito Akanji creepy old Vito?
Yeah, that was what I used to call my students, Vito. Yeah, creepy Uncle Vito.
Yeah, creepy Uncle Vito.
I very much take issue with Amelia Jones's account of his work, because she reads him as a very kind of masochistic character, and I don't buy that really as an account of his work. But I mean, he's a super interesting artist. But yeah, how much of Vito's work do you know, Tom, in general?
Not overly familiar with him.
So like his most famous piece is called Follow Piece, which is basically where he just followed people around until they went inside.
Or Seedbed. Tell Tom about Seedbed.
So Seedbed is what I talk to my students about. So Seedbed is a piece where in a gallery in New York for about a week, I think it was about 4 or 5 days, they built a like raised platform with like speakers in an otherwise empty room, and you go in as a viewer. This is like 1972 or 3 or something off the top of my head. You'd go in as a viewer and be this empty room with speakers, and you'd hear a man's voice basically saying like, I want to fuck you. I want to stick my dick up your ass. Like, come fuck me, come find me. And he's under the raised platform, like jacking off, like non-stop for a week.
That is the most 70s performance art thing I could think of. Like,
yeah.
You know, at least I'm sitting in a chair is fun to listen to.
So, I mean, to kind of bring things back, the reason that we're talking about him is because he ended up in Halifax and did this conceptual tattoo piece with the local tattooer named Bob McLean. Do we want to talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, because I think what's super interesting about that, and it's, again, a conversation that I was having recently with Manfred Kors, because they discovered that it was Tattoo Sammy who did the famous tattoo of the garter belt on the thigh of Valley Export. And no one until very recently knew who the tattooer was. And I think, like, Jamie, you and I talked about this a lot over the years, this kind of engagement of, you know, pretty kind of quotidian tattooers with conceptual and fine art is a story that I think is very undertold and needs to be told more, you know, to the point where a drawing or a photograph by George Burchett got mistaken and hung in the Tate as a piece of work by Dora Maar, like one of the most important like street art photographers and artistic figures of the early 20th century. So like what I love, you know, I remember when you were really sort of first making the or thinking about the Akanji piece, like this intersection is something that doesn't have a lot of art historical work behind it already, quite surprisingly, even for such a big figure, as important figure as Akanji, right?
I know. I was really surprised. And actually in, I think one of Vito's books, I think Diary of a Body, there's just a really brief mention of this piece. And in fact, I'm not even sure the brief discussions of this piece that have happened previously even mentioned the name of the tattooer, who is Bob McLean.
I certainly hadn't seen it. I hadn't seen it mentioned.
But I mean, essentially, what had happened is up to that point, and I was telling Tom NASCAD was undergoing a significant overhaul, and they were trying to bring it up to date with broader currents in contemporary art. And so one of the new faculty that were hired was a guy named Gerald Ferguson, or Jerry Ferguson. And so he was inviting all sorts of people to Halifax as visiting artists, but he was also really interested in local folk art. And for those of you who are interested in understanding kind of the interest of these conceptual artists in local folk art, there's a good book on this by Aaron Morton named For Folk's Sake, which provided a really lot of strong context for me as I was writing this chapter with regards to how these American artists were engaging with local cultural producers who are working in different mediums. And so Jerry Ferguson became involved with a local tattooer in Halifax named Bob McLean, and invited him to do a conceptual tattoo on his own body, on Ferguson's body. And then that led to him introducing Bob McLean to a curator in a nearby city named Luke Rombo, who commissioned McLean to produce 30 quote unquote tattoo drawings, which were essentially pieces of flash that were then exhibited throughout the Canadian Maritimes. Then he invited Bob McLean to participate in the NASCAD's newly established lithography workshop. And then when Vito Akanji came to town, Jerry Ferguson tells Vito Akanji about this local tattooer who he has been working on these projects with, and shows him his own conceptual tattoo. And Vito starts thinking about getting a tattoo of his own, which was going to be a line that bisected his entire body, minus his neck and face. And so while he's in Halifax, he's thinking about this for a few days. And Jerry Ferguson really had this way about him in which he would almost conceptualize other people's work and then push them into realizing it. And so Jerry was like, essentially, okay, I'm going to make the appointment at the tattoo shop. And Akanji is, still apprehensive about the tattoo, makes the appointment nevertheless. And between the two of them, Jerry says, okay, if you're not going to get tattooed, how about I'll buy a conceptual tattoo from you? And so Vito Akanji has this famous work called Trademarks, in which he, prior to arriving in Halifax, but the work itself didn't become famous until after, when it was published in Avalanche magazine. But what he did was bit himself on different parts of his body to create impressions, and then applied ink to the impressions, and then stamped those onto paper to create relief prints. And so what Jerry Ferguson wanted Vito to do is bite his leg, and then they would put some ink on it, and the teeth impressions would not be covered in ink because they were receded. And then Bob would tattoo these bite marks. And so that's exactly what happened. And Vito decided after that he wasn't going to get the tattoo that he had envisioned after all. But so I had Vito wrote like a little narrative of this piece that I think is published in a book, but also Akanji Studios had sent it to me, and it mentions that the event was filmed. And I think I bothered almost everyone who lived or who worked at or works at NASCAD to try and find this film. And I actually hunted down and befriended the art school student who filmed it, Brian McNevin, who is still a good friend of mine, who filmed it. And he told me about, and it was funny because Brian narrated the film to me based on his memory, and even some of the dialogue he recounted to me, and he hadn't seen the film since he had taken it in 1971. And when I finally found the film, it was almost exactly how he had described it to me, down to some of the phrases that Bob was uttering while they were in the tattoo shop, like fire away, Marquis de Sade, to tell to tell Vito to bite Jerry's leg. So I mean,
it's funny because Aconchi's such a canonical artist of that period of like performance, post Fluxus performance art, and that work is like just barely mentioned, and it was such an interesting, important find.
Yeah, barely mentioned. Yeah.
So I know we're running up on time, but there is one we can't let you go without talking about Mildred Brown and the story that you've had.
Yeah, right.
Trying to tell her story.
We're going to shift gears away from the book, so everyone knows.
So this isn't in the book, but because we're coming up to the time, and I just wanted to talk about this more recent work you've been doing about museums and freedom of information. So, like, I mean, people can read more about it if they just Google your name and Mildred Brown. But do you want to give us like the top line version of the story with her? Because that also came out of you following a kind of research loose end, right? You saw a mention of this woman who died and her tattoos were collected.
Canada had this kind of integrated museum database at the federal level that partner organizations across the country, not just federal institutions, could integrate their museum databases into. And I came across an image on there, and I actually thought it was a piece of flash because it looked like a piece of flash, this kind of horizontal board with a couple tattoo designs on it. The image was really low quality. So I emailed the institution, which is the Museum of Civilization in Quebec City, who told me that no, that's not drawings. Those are, I think, 5 or 6 pieces of tattooed human skin. I was like, whoa. I mean, I had obviously familiar with Gemma Angel's work, and Lombroso and Lacasson. And all the other institutions, mostly across the Atlantic, that hold piece of preserved tattooed skin. I had never seen anything like this in the Canadian context. And so, I mean, I wanted to learn more about this, but it didn't really coincide with the work that I was doing on commercial tattooing at the time. So I kind of filed it away. But then I returned to it a few years later, and I wanted to go to Quebec City to see this object in person, which was not an unusual request. As Matt knows, art historians, it's not an unusual thing to email whatever institution and say, hey, can I come look at these objects? And they told me that I couldn't, but that it was on display right now in a permanent collection show. And I said, well, can I come after it's out of the show? And they said no, which was strange. But I was like, okay, I'll just go to Quebec City and see it for myself. I was living in Montreal. It's like less than 3 hours. So I took the train to Quebec City to see this show. And then the text panel had a lot of dubious information on it, which turned out later to just be completely untrue. But I started asking about where the information on the text came from, and I want to know more about the provenance of this tattooed skin. And not only did they have this preserved tattooed skin in the show, they had a skull and a couple other human remains from the bodies of homicide victims. And it turns out that this object with the tattooed skin on it, one of the pieces of tattooed skin belonged to this woman who was murdered in Montreal in 1929, a young woman from the East Coast named Mildred Brown, and she hadn't even been in Montreal that long. The other pieces are from people who are unidentified thus far. And I went to do some archival research at the institution, and when I did that, my alarm bell started ringing because the archivist would only let me see certain documents, would only let me photograph certain parts of documents while covering up the others. But then he told me that there was an album of crime scene and autopsy photography taken by this forensic scientist who opened the first forensic crime lab in North America, which was in Montreal, named Wilfred Jerome. And in this album was an image of the woman, Mildred Brown, on the autopsy table with this tattoo still affixed to her body. But they would not let me see the album, despite the fact that other researchers had previously, and the album had been exhibited both online and in museum exhibitions. And so I filed a Freedom of Information request to see it. Meanwhile, what was happening behind the scenes within like days of me making these inquiries is the museum was corresponding with the provincial government, specifically the provincial forensic crime lab, who actually owned these items, but they had been on permanent loan to the museum since the late 90s. And they told the museum, okay, pull the tattoos from the exhibition.
You completely panicked them, right? It was just like, oh my God.
Yeah, but this was not a broader. They said it was about the tattoos had the ability to identify the people to whom they belonged, but this was not a broader moral or ethical stance on human remains more generally, because the other human remains in the exhibition, including sawed bones of a teenager or the skull of a young man who was murdered, they stayed up in the show and were exhibited for many more months. It was just my inquiry. And so I didn't even find out that they had been removed from the show until almost a year later, when I filed an access to information request to get all their emails. And then I saw that they had removed the tattoos from the show, and I went back to just get photographs of the display case that they had altered. But all of this set in motion. Initially I was only interested in these tattoos, but it set in motion a broader interest in the collection to which they were a part, and more particularly the human remains in it. And so what was essentially happening is, I should say, like, hi to the museum staff and the lawyers and employees of the provincial government, because they stalk my online presence and then oftentimes enter stuff that I post online into like evidence in court, or things that they'll use to cross-examine me. And they've even done such things as like hire a bailiff to intimidate me, chase me around, going to my old residences, talking to my landlords, talking to my neighbors, calling me to just try and intimidate me into capitulation. But to go back to what I was saying, essentially what was happening is, after Wilfred Jerome opened this provincial crime lab in 1914, he started collecting body parts from the bodies of mostly homicide victims whose deaths he was tasked with investigating. And so his collection differs from the likes of Cesare Lombroso or Alexander Lacasson, for example, because while those two were, or the Wellcome collection, but while those guys were collecting body parts from deceased or executed criminals primarily, Jerome was collecting body parts from crime victims. And this is something that has not been written about at all. And actually, the writing about Wilfred Jerome is quite hagiographic. And actually, there's a reason for this, because his archives and all of his materials are really tightly guarded. And the only people who have had access to them are people who are doing work and are funded and approved by the provincial government.
So I think we need to wrap up very imminently. But I was really amazed that you asked, because when they told you, well, you couldn't see them for privacy reasons, you pointed out that they'd been on public display for years. Yeah. And when you requested photographs of prior display, they sent you photographs of under Freedom of Information request. You sent requests for photos of the installations, and they sent you the public display photographs of these objects blacked out, so for privacy reasons, which is just an unbelievably cynical move.
And now I'm trying to get those photographs, because a few of those installations were at federal institutions, and the federal access to information commissioner has ruled that those institutions had to give those photographs to me, and they said
you won in court, right?
Not in court, but through the appeal process, at least at the federal level. But now what's happening is I still don't have those images, because the provincial government of Quebec is now taking the federal government to Quebec. The federal government to court to prevent them from disclosing these images to me. And so
images
there's two.
To be clear to the listeners, images of things that of things that were on public display until very recently.
Exactly. So there's two big ongoing multi-year court cases happening now with the provincial government against the federal government to prevent the disclosure of these images. So, what's going on here is the question. Why have they invested all of these resources to prevent this? I mean, I have some speculative thoughts in mind, but hopefully the truth will come out.
It's a story that remains to be told. Yeah.
Well, Jamie, I'll thank you for bringing a couple of extra listeners, new listeners to the show. For your harassers, you're very welcome to the show. And
subscribe to the Patreon.
Subscribe to the Patreon. You can hear this episode early.
No, hey guys.
Well, Jamie, thank you so much for coming on the show. That was such a fantastic chat. We don't get a whole lot of jokes off on this show. We got a good few of them today.
British humor.
Where can people find you? Where can people find your book? Let them know.
So, I mean, you can get my book directly from the press, McGill Queen's University Press. And if you want 35% off, you can use the code MQSP. But for international buyers, it may or may not be cheaper to buy from a local bookstore, which will be able to import it for you. Of course, it's on
the book is called Needlework, which is like the best name for a tattoo book. I'm very jealous because it's such
Needlework,
a fantastic
2 words.
title.
Yeah,
it's such a good title.
And then they can find me. My web address is jamiejelinski.com or .ca, and then my Instagram is at Dr. Jamie Jelinski.
Yeah, and also, not only to thank you to Jamie, but to our wonderful patrons who help keep this show running. If you subscribe to the Patreon at the £10 and above tier, you get a special shout out on the show. If you subscribe to the £15 tier, not only will you get a copy of Painted People, come November, you will get a signed copy of Matt's new book, Tattoos, The Untold History of Modern Art. And without further ado, it's thank you to Casey Wardell, Dylan, Eric Wynn, James Schick, Kathleen Burkhardt, Kirsten Wright, Reed Ford, Seb Lewis, Shit Jesus, Charlie Lightning, Chris Block, Morpheus Ravenna, and Roy Hoxema. Once again, catch us at the big London tattoo show, Tattooing with Al Pomeroy and Aaron James. And even if you're not getting a tattoo, maybe we can convince you to get one, or you can just have a chat with us about cool tattoo history. And with that, it is thank you from me and goodbye.
Bye.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate it. Thanks for everyone for listening.